to the Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho. Caritas is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the evolution of consciousness, both individually and collectively. We promote this evolution by offering presentations and interviews and classes and study groups on subjects relating to consciousness and also relating to healing, which we've been doing for the past 18 years. In 2019, we began recording our presentations, and all of our video recordings are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org, and also on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. Our program is made possible by the support of our members and donors. I hope that you will consider becoming a member or making a donation, both of which can be done on our website, caritascenter.org, to support what we do. And there we go. So let me introduce our guest. Tim Jackson is director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey in the UK. For over 3 decades, he has pioneered research on the moral, economic, and social dimensions of prosperity on a finite planet. His landmark book, Prosperity Without Growth, was the Financial Times Book of the Year and Unheard's Book of the Decade. It appeared in 17 foreign language editions worldwide. In 2016, he was awarded the Hillary Laureate for exceptional international leadership in sustainability. In addition to his academic work, Tim is an award-winning dramatist with numerous radio writing credits for the BBC. So welcome, Tim, and thank you so much for making time to be here. Oh, dear.
It's a pleasure to be here, Gloria. Thanks for inviting me.
I wanted to start out by with a quote, actually, from that I read on your a quote about your book, Post Growth, the new book, right? This is the book. Can you see it? All right. Post Growth: Life After Capitalism, and this was a quote by Rowan Williams, who was the former Archbishop of Canterbury. He said, "It is harder and harder to deny that we in the developed world are collectively prisoners of an addictive delusion, the myth of constantly increasing economic growth. In this brief but weighty book, Tim Jackson exposes this myth with unambiguous clarity and asks whether we are able to seize the opportunity for tough self-questioning prompted by the current global crisis." And as I watched one of your interviews on YouTube, Tim, and I don't remember which one it was, you said the following, and I wrote it down because I wanted to read it to our audience. It says, you said, "The idea that there is something out there for the human spirit worth aspiring to, beyond material accumulation, beyond comfort, beyond individual self-interest, and that something has not only a robust scientific basis in our psychology and our sociology and our physics of the real world, it actually has a resonance in our own heart." And I just love that quote, and it really encapsulates how I saw your book and how I personally feel about the state of things. Your book opens with Bobby Kennedy's speech in Kansas at the start of his presidential campaign. And I think that, you know, since you opened your book with this quote, I thought I found a clip on YouTube, and I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to just show it. It's only a minute or two long because I think it sets the tone nicely for this conversation. So let me see. I hope everybody can see and hear it properly. Okay.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community value in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder and chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman rifles and sex knives and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are Americans.
Okay. Were you guys able to see that and hear that okay? Yes? Okay,
Yeah, that was good.
Good. Yeah, I love that. So, so Tim, do you, when I see that recording and hear his words, I wonder what a difference he might have made had he been elected president, or if the forces of corporate lobbies and ownership of politicians would have prevented the changes he wanted to implement. What do you think?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell, and it's so tempting to wonder that. You know, what a different world it might have been if he had been elected president in that campaign. I mean, I have to say that fragment that you just played there, I discovered that quite late actually in my career. I think it was unearthed. That recording was unearthed from a basement at Kansas University around about the late 1990s, early 2000s. And at that stage, I was actually working on a kind of replacement for the GDP, an adapted GDP to kind of take into account some of those things. And nobody was taking us seriously. You know, nobody in government was interested in that stuff. And even the statistical offices at that stage didn't care too much. So it was really just a couple of guys. It was me and a young colleague kind of seeing the work that Herman Daly and John Cobb had done in the US and wanting to replicate that for the UK and eventually also for Sweden. So I did a couple of exercises where I was working on this, and it's just calculation, you know, it's spreadsheets and it's numbers and it's statistics and it's putting stuff together. And I remember that kind of frisson of excitement when we heard about this recording, and it kind of made us feel like we were connected to something deeper, to a sort of historical truth, a historical trend, and that to have actually someone who aspired to be the president of the biggest economy in the world at that point in time, actually questioning that measurement was extraordinary to us. And I was kind of, you know, still quite a young researcher in those days. And then it was, because that speech became a kind of poster poster speech in a way for questioning economic growth. I wanted to start the book with the story of Bobby Kennedy and the story of that speech, and I was quite lucky to make contact with actually the guy who wrote that speech for him, Adam Walensky, and to kind of ask him about the circumstances of the speech and to track down a little bit of what was going on, you know, for them in that campaign during that time. And Walensky himself was very young at the time. He was just a young, you know, very progressive, very energetic speechwriter. He was absolutely carried away by Bobby Kennedy's campaign. It had worked with him over a couple of years before that. And what I kind of, you know, what really struck me as I delved into that story more and more is that the question of how we measure the size of the economy was not the least important thing, but it was not the most important thing in that speech. In a way, Kennedy was also setting out a kind of vision for a different kind of society. He was really calling on that idea that our sense of progress should be driven by our values, by our deepest values. And he was prepared to say that. And he was prepared to say it, you know, in a presidential campaign. And the reaction of the crowd when he said it, and he turned up at that University of Kansas campus, and he gave a speech in a basketball court, and the crowd absolutely loved it. And he had this ecstatic welcome, and it was the second speech of his presidential campaign in 1968. And that for me was, you know, again, going beyond the science and the statistics and the numbers, and it was telling a human story, a story actually with a very tragic ending in some ways, but a story that made me feel that our ideas and the ideas of all of the people that I talk about in post-growth over a long period of time are kind of connected to each other, and they provide us today with an enormous resource if we're prepared to listen to it. Mm-hmm. And that resource is the basis for thinking differently about the world we want to be in and how to get there.
Yeah. And it, you know, what hit me when I saw that in your book was that this is not a new idea. This has been around, you know, for at least since 68.
Yeah, exactly.
Not a new, you know, maybe hopefully it'll be a movement, a bigger movement as we go forward, but it's not a new idea. Yeah. So do you think there is a legacy, a historical legacy that he set, or do you think it was largely forgotten?
I think he had a legacy. Yeah. You know, his daughter wrote, I shared a platform with his daughter actually on the 50th anniversary of that speech, and Kerry Kennedy, one of his daughters, and she wrote this book called Ripples of Hope, which is a record of the people that were influenced by Kennedy and the impact that his thinking had on their lives over the half century after his death. And it's very moving, really. You know, it's kind of trivial in a way to say that we all have a legacy. I do happen to believe it's true, but I think the people that I wrote about in post-growth, I think, had a profound legacy, and what it seemed to me as I kind of connected those stories together was that they somehow had ideas that really reinforced each other, but were very countercultural. Even today, they speak to something which is lighting the way to a different cultural direction than the one that we seem to have rushed headlong through. Yeah. And so I would say, you know, that legacy exists, and it remains for us to use that legacy and to benefit from it, to explore it further. Mm.
Tim, you are an ecological economist. Can you tell us exactly what that means and why what made you decide to become one?
Yeah, I mean, an ecological economist is an economist who really takes seriously the fact that we live on a finite planet. That's it, to be honest. And economists generally tend to kind of think we can escape all of those limits that have come with being on a finite planet by being very clever with technology or efficient with our capital. And ecological economists kind of say, well, I think you've got to take it a bit more seriously than that. The planet's not getting any bigger. At some point, if you keep expanding the economy, it's going to have an impact. And in fact, we know that it's already having an impact. It's damaging the climate. It's decimating other species. It's destroying their habitats. It's polluting the ocean. The list goes on. And what ecological economics tries to do, and it's been around, I guess, for about 35 years, is to argue that you should really start when you're thinking about the economy by thinking about the relationship to the planet and the finite resources. And interestingly, my story into economics is quite a bizarre one. I was in London at the time. You mentioned the playwriting. I was writing plays for the BBC, and I kind of thought that was the way my career would go. But I wasn't really making very much money at it at that point, and I was making up the cost of my rent by working, waiting on tables and working in bars and anything I could find really to make a little bit of extra money. And then in April 1986, Chernobyl melted down, and I kind of realized, I had been trained as a mathematician and a physicist, and I had these scientific skills, and I realized that I had skills that kind of could be useful in solving that predicament of technological abandon that nuclear power to me represents, and Chernobyl to some extent epitomized. And I kind of, the next day I remember going into the offices of Greenpeace in London and saying, look, I don't know if you can do anything with the skills I've got, but I kind of want to be involved in doing something to offset these dangers. And they set me working on the economics of renewable energy, of wind power and solar power and so on. And it was a strange moment in time, because ever since, from that moment onwards, almost literally, I have been called on to be, if you like, a kind of accidental economist. Mm-hmm. And ecological economics became my home for 35 years.
Yeah, it seems that you were called to develop both sides of your brain.
Yeah, and that's I think that's true. That's a really interesting way to think of it, because for a long time I juggled those two things together, being a playwright and doing this scientific ecological economics work. And in some ways, post-growth I think of post-growth as a little bit as bringing together those two sides of my brain a little bit more, because it is more of a storytelling book than a
there's
scientific
a lot of creativity involved in trying to figure out how to make this transition into a post-growth economy.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. I wondered what this sofa represents on your. Does that represent the pandemic and everyone sitting on the couch in lockdown, or what did that sofa represent on the cover of your book?
I'm not at liberty to say. That's actually a trade secret. It's held only by the publishers, and everyone else can make their own interpretation of that sofa. But okay. No, I'm kidding. I mean, it's really interesting. We were playing with images, and we play with some sort of conventional images, planet-shaped things and trees and bits of abstract art with greenery around them and that kind of thing. And then we came across this image of the sofa, and I don't know why, but it kind of spoke to something. I think more that sense of that the picture gives of a place to.
It looks like a beach.
It does look like a beach, doesn't it? It looks like, but it also looks like somewhere where if you came across a sofa like that, you'd really want to sit in it for quite a long time.
Maybe a desert.
And think about stuff.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it represents to me, at any rate. But
I see.
it's interesting because even I was at an event on a Wednesday, a book festival, and the man came up to me and said, "My kids really love that picture of the sofa." And I said, "How old are they?" And he said, "They're 4 and 2." And they kind of, I don't know what they would think of the contents of the book, but they like the cover.
Okay. I heard you in an interview reference the index of economic welfare as a motivating factor in your thinking about the predominance of the GDP as a measure of a country's economic growth, economic health. Would you talk about the difference between these two measurements and their respective values?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the exercise that I mentioned, the exercise I was engaged in when we came across that speech by Bobby Kennedy, and essentially what the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare did, it's actually changed its name now. It's mostly called the Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI, instead of GDP. But what the index tries to do is it tries to quantify some of those things that Kennedy was talking about in his speech. So the damage that's caused through pollution, through cutting down ancient forests, through the environmental damage that's caused through our factories, and the carnage on the streets that they talk about, and also that sort of militarization of our society that he was deploring. And it kind of tries to put some sort of economic cost on those, and also to add in the benefits of things that we don't tend to count in society, like the value of housework, for example, of unpaid labor, and it puts all those numbers together, and then it sort of compares what happens with the GDP and what happens with this index. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting story, partly interesting because it happens in almost every country that has tried to do this exercise, which is that the index follows the growth of GDP up to a certain point, and that's usually around about the 1960s, 1970s. And then it begins to diverge from it, really by stagnating. So it flattens out the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, even while the GDP keeps growing and growing and growing. And sometimes towards the end of the period, the index is actually going downwards. So it kind of suggests that when you begin to look at all of the things that matter, the direction of travel doesn't look like progress anymore. Sometimes it just looks like stagnation, and sometimes it even looks like we're traveling in the wrong direction. And that's, of course, a very shocking finding. And it's part of the reason, I think, why the index is disputed. I've tried for, I would say, well over 2 decades to have politicians take seriously that exercise. But I'm absolutely staggered to find that there is now before Congress a genuine progress indicator bill in the US.
Oh, really?
So yeah, and I don't know how far it's going to get, but I do, I have high hopes that at least it will kind of move the debate onwards past this indicator of the GDP, and maybe even one day we will be measuring what Bobby Kennedy was suggesting we should be measuring.
Well, I'm a fan of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, whose economic policy evidently is that economic growth should not come at the expense of the well-being and happiness of the people. And
exactly.
I was so impressed when I heard that.
And they have put that into practice. They have a kind of indicator framework, which they call the Living Standards Framework, and they use that in New Zealand to each year to decide what they call a well-being budget. So using the indicators, figuring out where the priorities for expenditure of government should be, and then actually putting money into those places. And that's very, very different approach from the one that's in many other advanced economies, which money is put into places which people believe will stimulate economic growth. It's a very, this is about putting well-being first.
Yeah. Well, it's like what you say in your book, that where you have insufficiency, then growth is appropriate. But where you have enough, growth, constantly trying to grow from there is not appropriate. Karen has her hand up. Karen, would you like to? Where are you?
I have a question. Yes. Thank you, Tim, for everything you're offering and sharing with us. My question is about COVID, the coronavirus. Particularly, any comments you have about benefits from this experience our planet is having, both ecologically and economically?
Yeah, I mean, it was for me quite influential in terms of the way that I wrote the book and what I was writing about. And in fact, I had to basically start again with the book because I had already started it when the pandemic came. And then there were the very, very clear things, like as we slowed down our economy, the environment began to recover in certain ways. And carbon emissions were 7% lower during 2020, for example. And you could see further in some of the most polluted areas of the world because the smog began to lift. And then there were stories of kind of wildlife coming back to places that they had not been able to be before. So there was a lot of a sense that the space that that humanity had occupied and pushing nature back had reduced, and that had allowed nature somehow to recover a little bit. And it's now telling that actually we've kind of almost reversed almost all of those gains, environmental terms. But I think we also learned some deeper lessons, and for me that was in particular, I think, a little bit around what Gloria was just talking about, which is this idea that actually our prosperity first and foremost is about health rather than wealth. And when you cast it in those terms, it's quite remarkable, because when you think about prosperity as wealth, you think about accumulating wealth and having more of it, and progress being about having more of it. Whereas when you think about health is almost always a balance. It's almost always this very finely balanced, what Aristotle called a virtuous place, where the good life lies between deficiency and excess. Mm-hmm. And a very simple example of that is in the question of food and how much food we have. And the World Health Organization now tells us that more people die from diseases of overconsumption than die from undernutrition. And that's an extraordinary indictment, really, of a system that just continually pushes people forwards to have, and wanting to have more, and producing the structures which give them more. And in that world, in a world that's always pushing you towards more, the first casualty of that is your sense of balance, and being able to balance, and being able to understand when more is better and when less might be better, in fact. And that was, I think that was a quite a profound lesson from the pandemic, and one that
mostly in the Western world, the first world countries, or is that across the board?
It's actually across the board, which is again quite striking. I mean, there is obviously huge inequality in that, and there are still more than 1 billion people with inadequate nutrition, and that is that coexists with a world in which there are towards 2 billion people who are overweight or obese, and that's, you know, historically unprecedented, both in terms of the inequality of that poverty and excess, and also in terms of the damage that excess is causing in terms of health.
Wow. Yeah. Sobering. What about the Green New Deal? How does the post-growth movement differ, or does it differ from the Green New Deal?
It's quite a complicated question, but it's a very interesting one. The Green New Deal models itself on FDR's New Deal in the late 1930s, and that was an attempt to sort of say that the government has a role to stimulate the economy when, and this, if remember, this was just after the Great Depression, when people were losing their jobs and the economy was crashing and people's livelihoods were at risk. And FDR's New Deal was a way of sort of saying the government has a responsibility to spend in these circumstances in order to stimulate that economy, to get things moving again, to provide people with jobs. And in the process, the New Deal did some extraordinary things. You know, it built many of the highways that still exist today. It built schools at that time that are still the basis for the school system in the US. And the Green New Deal actually first was talked about after the financial crisis as a way of stimulating the economy after the financial crisis by investing in the technologies that we need to combat climate change and to prevent environmental damage. And it is in the sense that it's calling for government intervention to protect the stability of the economy, and it's calling for government intervention to protect the climate and to protect the planet. It has a lot in common with the ideas that I'm talking about. Then the difference, and the thing that's slightly tricky about it, and it's a little bit kind of difficult to explain, but it's this sense in which, how far are we going to stimulate this economy? How much of this is about stimulating more economic growth, and how much is it about stabilizing the economy and creating those investments that we know that we need in order to protect the planet that we live on? And the conventional way of thinking about the Green New Deal tends to be predicated on the idea that we need to get economic growth back again through this Green New Deal. But there's beginning to be a kind of questioning of that, a questioning of whether we could have a green and social New Deal that didn't have to be paid for in the future by having more and more growth, that could actually be more appropriate for an economy which was within the scale of the planet rather than pushing against that scale constantly. Mm-hmm. And many of the things that the people who are advocates of the Green New Deal would talk about are also things that I would very much talk about and very much agree with in relation to managing the economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the trick is in determining which areas of a culture need growth and which do not. How do we curtail the growth where necessary when the corporate sector pushes through indiscriminate growth and consumerism? I
think that's right. Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the ways that the Green New Deal has been construed is by investing, you know, a lot of money in new technologies, in these renewable energy technologies, in solar and wind and biomass and electric vehicles and so on and so forth. And all of those things are needed for this transition. I am not against those at all. In fact, I argued, that's where I started, if you remember, was looking at the economics of all that when I started out. But I think what goes missing in that account is the same lesson that I was talking about before, that actually health is the basis of our prosperity. And in an economy in which you recognize that, you want the economy to be an economy of care, a care-based economy.
Okay. Yeah.
And when you do that, when you think about that, you begin to think about which jobs to support in a slightly different way. And it turns out, in fact, that those jobs, which are jobs of care and service and health and education and community and renovation, those jobs are as green, if not greener, than the jobs that are building new technologies like wind turbines and solar power, because that sector of our economy is all about the time that people spend in the service of other people in the economy. It's not about material stuff. It's not about making stuff and throwing it away again. It's about our service to each other. And that tends to be light in terms of carbon, light in material terms. It's huge value in terms of our quality of life. It's more labor intensive, so it's a good way of employing people. And quite often, if you can get the conditions right, those kinds of jobs can be amongst the most fulfilling jobs in society. So this is a transition, and it speaks a little bit to that quote that you mentioned earlier, Gloria, and this sense that actually this economy, this post-growth economy, could be a richer, more fulfilling, more caring place, a better society than the one that we get by chasing growth through productivity and efficiency and technology.
Mm-hmm. And I tend to regard education as key to societal change. What are your thoughts on how education, our educational system, can steer us in the direction of post-growth?
I think it can. I'm not sure it always is. In fact, some of my students are kind of working on environmental education and what environmental education means, particularly for kids, and how you stimulate it. And, you know, it's interesting, actually, that the best benefits from environmental education sometimes come outside the formal education system, partly because the formal education system increasingly is training members of the economy rather than members of society, is training people to be, you know, productive and consumerist,
right?
Rather than really giving them a sense of their place in the world and our place in the cosmos and the potential of the human spirit, or even the enjoyment of quality of life, or even, and this is, you know, it shows how far we've come away from the earlier ideals of education, even moving away from that idea of knowledge and insight for its own sake. We increasingly, and I work inside a university, so I kind of see this from day to day, and I've seen it progress over the time that I've been there. Increasingly, we deprioritize knowledge for its own sake, and we don't give our kids that immersion in nature through which they can learn for themselves. But
I've always felt that even starting in elementary school, that is the case, that you're studying to get a good grade. You're studying, you know, you're learning for reasons other than the intrinsic benefit that learning has. And so it stifles curiosity. It's, you know, it's
this one of my PhD students, her research is really showing exactly that you know, this question of intrinsic curiosity and intrinsic engagement with the subject matter gets lost inside very structured education environments and with different with sort of extrinsically imposed goals on education. You begin to lose that. I just saw, Gloria, that Edna's had her hand up for
yes, she has.
quite a long time.
Go ahead, Edna. You've got to unmute.
Whoops, here. I think my phone works better than my computer. Yeah, I actually am like an ancient environmental economist. Anyway, I always was interested in like the book, The Limits of Growth, and I knew Howard Odum. You might have heard of him. I guess
he was one of my earliest writers that I was reading when I was younger.
Yeah. So I haven't had much effect on the world, I don't think. But anyway, I was going to ask you about the happiness index, but then you started talking about investment, and I like you put together stable. Well, you didn't have the gerund thing, but stabilizing investment as opposed to financial investment. I think that's a really good set of words because, well, so I have to backtrack it. I just moved to New Mexico, and there's this company that wants to take over the electric power, the local power thing, and it's an international company, and they're dangling all kinds of things about economic development and energy. I mean, it's like a pittance, but basically they just want to take over this land that has a lot of potential for solar and wind to ship to California and Texas. I mean, that's what they really want to do. So I started looking into I tried to write an opinion letter about that we don't know anything about what kind of investment they would make. Well, I don't think I got very well. I don't think anyone's paid attention to anything. But then it just got me thinking that people just think of, when you say investment, they think of financial. They don't think of what kind of investment is it. So that's why I like your word stabilizing. And I began today, I was thinking about, is there any parallel in nature for stabilizing investment? I'm sure there must be. The only one I thought of so far is the soil, like how, plants grow and die, and then the detritus becomes material to enrich the soil. Right. But so I just think we need an ethic that we need to do this stabilizing investment, like even maybe like tithing, like 10% of whatever the other nasty profit stuff is, like some of that needs to go back to rebuilding or stabilizing. And so I don't think people are, we might, as you said, the Green New Deal is kind of like, could be more of the same, just in a different mask. But I really like your writing. I just love the book. I just got Hannah Arendt's, not The Human Condition, but the other one. What is it? The Life of the Mind. Yeah. Right. And I love Thich Nhat Hanh, and I didn't know about Emily Dickinson, but I was just really moved. So I just loved how you put together art and creativity with the problems that we have. Because there's lots of books about how terrible things are, but I just find that you give us some hope by talking about these people that have had these inspirations. Anyway, I quit. Okay.
No, thank you for that, Edna. I think I'm really glad that you picked up that point, because it was very much what I was trying to do with Post-Growth, was to bring poetry and narrative and the stories of people together to bring economics alive. But one of my long-term projects is to remake economic concepts. And I think particularly the concept of investment has been tarnished by what happened, particularly what happened from about 1980 onwards, when it became more or less a gambling casino where, if you were lucky and rich, you could reap all the rewards and the devil take the hindmost almost. And that led to the financial crisis, which then, tarnished the financial sector as a whole. Governments basically rescued the financial sector. They sort of rewarded the architects of chaos in that, and then had to pay for that by imposing austerity on people. And that, that to me that was like a sacrilege, because it was not what investment is or should be. And so I wanted to reframe that. And my kind of reframing is that investment, and I love the fact that you talk about an analogy in nature, because I think that's really important. And to me, that investment is like a commitment to the future. And the character who I chose to represent that was Wangari Maathai, who founded the Greenbelt movement in Kenya in the 1970s and 80s. And she embodied that sense of stabilizing soils, stabilizing the environment by just planting trees as an investment. And that simple act of planting trees, to me, is like a metaphor which rescues the economic concept of investment. And if we could mirror our financial investments on that idea of commitment to the future, then I think we would rescue not only ourselves, but also the discipline of economics.
Paul?
Yes, first of all, I want to thank you for your book. I really enjoyed it. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, which I think is exemplary. And I just wish more people were doing what you're doing. I share your experience in academia. Most of my education in economics was extremely disappointing and disheartening. And, even today we're using lousy metrics for well-being and we're still teaching neoclassical economics, at least at the undergraduate level. The other disciplines or the offshoots, such as behavioral economics and environmental economics, true cost economics, all of those have been around for a while, but as far as I can tell, especially in academia, they're not making much of an inroad. So my question to you is, beyond writing books, which is very important, and I think that's a wonderful accomplishment, but in terms of where the rubber meets the road, how can we better influence the direction of economic thought in such a way as to advance and support quality of life factors rather than the idiotic metrics that we use? And I realize it's worse in the United States than it is in Europe. So I'm not trying to condemn Europe at all, but in the United States, we seem to be particularly bullheaded and myopic. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I wish I had an easy answer or a story of instant success to tell you. I think it is a hard battle. I mean, on the other hand, when I think of the distance traveled between Prosperity Without Growth that Gloria mentioned, which was written originally as a report to the UK government back in 2009, and in the intervening decade or so, I think that debate about economics and within economics has moved quite a long way, certainly a lot faster than it moved in the previous decades. And so that there is, and I detect this, there is within the discipline, and there is actually also at the policy level, there's much more of a questioning of that growth-based model. There's much more questioning of the neoclassical model in particular than there has been certainly during my professional life, I would say. And at the same time, of course, that sometimes seems painfully slow. Interestingly, a lot of the call for that change comes from economic students, so young people, essentially. Sorry, I'm just going to have to find some power here. My computer's about to crash, so I wouldn't like to do that. And good, we're fixed.
Well, it's like who was it who said evolution happens one death at a time?
Right.
Young people taking the reins and doing what we need. And
it was a real moment in time, really, after the financial crisis, and particularly through the Occupy movement, I suppose, and then there was an Occupy economics movement, and there was a rethinking economics movement, and then I don't know if you know of the Manku, who's one of the famous US macroeconomists, and he turned up one day to find a note on his door saying, "We're boycotting your classes until you begin to give us the economics we need." And that, and this is a call for a different kind of economics from a young generation of economic students, and I quite like it for this simple reason, that economics professors ought to understand that if there is a demand for a different kind of economics, then sooner or later economics professors are going to have to supply it, because that's the rules of the market. So it's, you know, it's maybe a little hopeful to suppose that's going to happen tomorrow. And certainly, you know, to answer what else you do or what else I do apart from writing books, I think it's really important to begin to provide that different economics, to begin to build it, to provide it for students, to create a network, to create a culture of a different way of thinking about economics, and also to take that into policy. So some of our work in the university, actually, we are the secretariat for an all-party parliamentary group on the limits to growth. And that's, you know, I would say that's hard work. It's like inching your way up a rock face with a torrent of water cascading down, trying to pull you off and making the rock face slippery the whole time. And you knock one peg in just to haul yourself a couple of inches higher each year, and you feel like that's progress. And it has that sense of a kind of continual moving of the frontier and finding of the frontier. And I don't know, I couldn't guarantee to you how fast or how successful that process is going to be. But on the other hand, I'm not sure what else you do in those circumstances when you see that change is necessary. You know, it is about that continual kind of carving out of the next stepping stone.
Just to finish up on the comment, I'm retired, and so I've been an author for many years, and I write lots of books. So I'm not trying to denigrate, you know, being an author. I think it's a wonderful profession, and teaching as well. But I oftentimes catch myself thinking that I should be doing more, and I should be influencing more.
Yeah.
And that and sometimes I wonder if we can afford to wait for the next generation to you know, grab the baton and run faster with it than we have. So many of the issues that we're dealing with seem imminent. And I don't think we had much lag.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, it's very tempting almost to say, well, let's wait for the next generation. But actually what the next generation is saying, and they're saying it very loud and clear, is, you know, we are not your escape route. You are the ones with the responsibility, and you still have that responsibility. So I think I absolutely agree with you. You know, it has to move faster, and it has to be one of the things that we do, is to give kids an education that's better than they have had. But it isn't the only thing we can do, and it isn't the only thing we should do.
Jeff had his hand up for a while.
Oh, thank you. And I have my comment is kind of similar to a previous comment. I apologize, I haven't read any of your books, but I was wondering, what is the incentive for the leaders of the S&P 500 or the Global 1000 corporations to move to a different model of success? I think most of capitalism is based on incentives, and my friends in the corporate world on our discussions, I kind of go back to that. And I was wondering, is ESG reporting a positive step in this direction?
It's a very loaded question, actually. I can point you to a lovely essay by a guy called Tariq Fancy, who was the ESG guru for BlackRock until he resigned in protest because he felt as though ESG was just a cover for not making sufficient progress. And that even as people were lobbying for, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance factors as being determinants of success of investment, as much as financial factors. And there's a lot of movement in that in the financial sector. There's a lot of recognition, increasing recognition, surprising recognition, really, by all kinds of financial institutions that they need to take those governance factors into account, the social factors into account, the environmental factors into account. There's a movement to ensure that financial institutions figure out what their exposure is to carbon, for example, in relation to climate change. And all of those things are slowly shifting the culture, I think, of those incentives, and beginning to draw attention to the fact that actually, short-term investment benefits in polluting companies, in companies that have high carbon profiles, that have unjust supply chains, that exploit child labor, that are dangerous in their products, that these short-term benefits are not in society's interest, and that over time society is going to move against those kinds of returns. And indeed, in some cases, that's going to create instability, in the financial instability for those companies that continue to invest in those kinds of returns. And that's an interesting place to be. I would say that, again, we see a great deal more noise about that idea in the financial sector than I have seen in my experience of looking at it. And it's quite a young idea. It's only really been around for 10, 15 years, that kind of ESG idea in the financial sector. But it has now, I think, a kind of momentum which sort of suggests that things are shifting. They're providing different incentive structures. But Tariq Fancy's critique of that, and I think it's a very valid one, is basically that even as companies are doing that, they're lobbying governments not to put a carbon price, not to introduce a carbon tax, not to introduce restrictions on mining, and indeed sort of undermining that benefit that the ESG movement might have within the financial institutions by their political lobbying activities outside of it, and not being vociferous enough about the fact that actually, if we want to meet our climate goals, for example, we need not to be investing any money at all in digging fossil fuels out of the ground. So I'm anxious, I suppose I would say, in the face of your question, because your question is sort of saying that our institutions are run by very particular kinds of incentives, and that those incentives tend to push in the wrong direction. And I would have to kind of agree with that. And the best that we have at the moment.
And even more than that, on the incentives, I spent most of my life in the corporate world. I'm a retired CPA. But, this week we just had a disclosure about world leaders hiding vast sums that they're stealing and misappropriating. And, I'm just talking about from the corporate people that I think are trying to do a good job for the most part, and trying to run these corporations, as a profitable way. But then there's just the lack of values around the world and the leaders. And I've never even really talked about people like that, some of these sociopaths that are running these countries and just ripping off their citizens and that. I don't see anybody in the spiritual world really talking about those type of people.
I think that's a very valid point. And to me, it is to me a question of values. It is the way in which those values have become almost ritualized in our society, those destructive values, and how in the process they've undermined the values of social responsibility and indeed of national and political responsibility, particularly through difficult eras that your country and indeed my country have gone through politically in the last little while. And it's, to me, it's one of the reasons why, for all the policy work is really important and the education is really important, it's also, I think, critical to be working at that level of value and replacing cultural values and supporting cultural values. That would provide us with a way of understanding and indeed of countering this undermining social values that's going on, I think, both within the corporate sector and by those leaders that you're talking about.
One of the values that comes to mind when you talk about that you talk about in your book is the difference between work and labor, and how capitalism has redefined both of those concepts, both of those terms. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. The book is, in some ways, it's a very challenging book because its subtitle is Life After Capitalism. If you say something like that, in fact, when I was economics commissioner, I couldn't have said something like that, really. And I didn't talk about capitalism and the structures of capitalism in Prosperity Without Growth, but I increasingly began to feel that I should do, and I had to, because this in some sense was one of the lessons to me from the pandemic as well, because it seemed to me paramount that there were certain aspects of capitalism which were beginning to undermine our society. And one of the most striking lessons in the pandemic was that the people who mattered most, the people who saved our lives, who protected our livelihoods, who provided us with what we needed when the rest of the economy was closed down, actually were some of the most poorly paid, most precarious lifestyles, most insecure jobs, and had the least status in society.
Yeah.
And yet they turned out to be the most important people in society. And I kind of asked myself over and over again, how did that happen? How did that happen? And it happened in two very different ways. And this is where I drew on the work of Hannah Arendt that you're talking about, Gloria, because Hannah draws a distinction between labor and work. And it's a little bit odd because we use them interchangeably, but she sort of said, well, those words exist actually in almost every language, so maybe there is a difference. And what she talked about with labor was really the labor of nurturing and caring and maintaining the hard graft of keeping life going. And those were the jobs that mattered during the pandemic, that sense of the jobs that nurtured our lives and kept us going and maintained us. And they were also the jobs which had been neglected, and that capitalism itself had neglected. And in understanding why those jobs had been neglected, I think we have to look, in a sense, to the structure of capitalism and its continual pursuit of productivity growth. And many of those jobs resist productivity growth because they're about the time that we spend in the service of each other, as I was talking about before. And that's, in a sense, why in capitalism, your wages are supposed to follow productivity growth. So if you're in a sector which just doesn't really do productivity growth because it's about service, it's about nurture, it's about maintenance, then you end up at the bottom of the pile. So in other words, capitalism has denigrated labor. It's allowed the most important jobs in society actually to be the least rewarded and the least secure. And that lesson came home to us through the pandemic. And then the other curious point that Hannah Arendt raises is when she begins to talk about work. Because one of the things that capitalism has done, its efficiencies have done, is allowed us to reduce the time that we spend in labor. We have labor saving devices. We have some increases in productivity which actually help us and reduce the time that we need to spend in labor. And Hannah sort of looks at that and she says, and what happens when we raise our eyes from this visceral task of labor and maintenance and nurturing? And suddenly we have a little bit more time in the world, because that's what civilization and industry and technology and efficiency and capitalism has brought us. And she says, she gives a really surprising answer, which is that, once we have this time on our hands that our ancestors probably would not have had, the first thing we see is our own mortality. And that presents us with a very different task, the task of confronting and understanding our mortality and thinking about our society and trying to create a permanence in society that doesn't really exist in the individual life, creating durability, in other words. And that's the task of work, is creating what she calls the human artifice, a world of artifacts and structures and institutions that go on beyond us, and in some sense provide a buffer against our fear of immortality. And the most extraordinary thing of all about that is that capitalism has also undermined that and has to undermine that. And it has to undermine it because durability is really inimical to growth and the increase of production. If things last too long, you know, we've all seen the struggle of obsolescence and planned obsolescence. That's an attack on durability, and it's an attack on durability in the name of profits achieved from selling and making more things. We don't need things to last. We cannot afford for things to last in capitalism. They must fall apart so that we can continue to remake them and continue to employ people to remake them and keep the system going.
And
so it's extraordinary, but the capitalism has undermined both labor and work in our society, and that's a very profound thing to come to terms with.
Kara had a question.
Hi, yeah, I just, there's another dimension to what you were talking about regarding, you know, essential workers and their lack of value in our society and culture, in that, you know, the majority of people who occupy those spaces of, you know, service and nurturing and caring for are women, and especially women of color. So I was wondering if you could speak to that dimension of the whole puzzle as well.
It is absolutely true, and it isn't right that it is so necessarily, that division of labor, and that the part about and what certainly I think there is a very strong argument to suggest that division of labor has given a division of status, because the value orientation of our society has been towards this sense of productivity, but that has in itself, it has coincided with the diminution in the status of women, of minorities, and of disadvantaged people generally. And that disadvantage and the lack of status has gone alongside these vital jobs in the world, and it's created the sense that they are low status jobs. And it's not just a tragedy, it's a crime. There's no doubt about that. And I think, you know, in the sense that women's rights and Black Lives Matter is beginning to draw attention to these inequalities is of course really important. But what's even more important, in fact, is to create the economics that would allow us to see these jobs for the value that they have in society. And that will in itself, that will help the division and the devaluation of minorities and of women and of sexual minorities that has happened in society, it seems to me. And I'm obviously, you know, I'm a white middle-aged man. I'm not really in a position to speak about white male privilege, but it is absolutely clear to me that this agenda of putting care and the economy of care back at the heart of society is an agenda that should benefit those minorities and should benefit women. And I applaud that. I would say I would also like to see a world in which that gender division was less. I think it, you know, in the same sense that women have been punished by that division, I think men have also been disadvantaged by it, and to open that possibility of men moving into caring professions is something that I think would enrich society.
Yes.
Thank you.
Tim, you write about the necessity of recognizing that we live on a planet which is limited, right, in terms of natural resources, and in contrast to the capitalist notion of infinite growth. And I wonder how much of this notion, at least in the US, comes from our frontier heritage. It wasn't very long ago that our relatively young country was still exploring and expanding our frontiers across the continent, and that our legacy was always looking for the next frontier. Now that there's no more undiscovered land here, it's being redirected, it seems, into expanding our economic frontiers. But Carl Jung said that the next frontier would be exploring our inner dimensions and fostering our inner growth. And I think we need to redirect our frontier-seeking tendency from wanting to continuously expand externally and materially to the more maturing process of expanding and evolving our consciousness. And as you put it, our capacity to be in a state of flow, so that we need not repress our desire for growth, just channel it in ways that evolve us.
Yeah.
Our desire for infinite growth is inherent in our human nature, but it can only be achieved internally. That's where there's no limits. But when that inner growth and expansion aren't taking place, then we externalize it and we project the need outward, which we're finding out results in a lot of destruction and suffering and threat to our well-being, to our continuity.
I absolutely love that quote from Jung, and I, in a sense, that's almost for me a central project in the book, is to explore that idea, to point actually to a kind of almost like a new humanism, a sense of human potential that we barely glimpse at the moment. Because in a sense we've externalized so much of our sense of the growth and achievement through that frontier spirit into an external world. And that, I would say that force is still very strong. I wrote a piece recently about the billionaire space race, this kind of sense the final frontiers on planet Earth have all been taken over, but now we must, the future of mankind is colonies on Mars. And
instead of saving our planet, we'll just move.
Instead of, which may be okay if these extraordinarily rich men can, find enough space there and enough resources to sustain the life for a few people, but it's not in any sense a rescue remedy for 8 billion people on this planet. And a lot of, in a way, what I have been trying to do in my work is to figure out a prosperity that could belong to anybody, that anybody on the planet could achieve, and that's where I brought this concept of flow and being in flow into the book, because it's to me it's a kind of indication of that other journey, that inner journey, and the journey towards a fulfillment that we barely glimpse most of the time, but actually is quite well documented in psychology in certain arenas, being in the zone in a sporting arena. And the concept of flow came as much as anything out of sports psychology, and that sense of being in a place where your skill matches the challenge that you're facing, and you become so immersed in the task that you lose your sense of self in the task itself. You lose the boundaries between yourself and other people. You lose your boundaries between yourself and the world. It's an extraordinary kind of peak experience that we tend to think is only available to certain people under certain conditions. But actually, the psychological research tells a slightly different story, and we've been doing some of that research, and it talks about it as a uniquely human ability that is accessible to anyone under the right conditions. And it's a very democratizable ability. It doesn't depend on you being rich. And so, in fact, sometimes being very rich and being very materialistic stands in the way of your ability to experience flow. And it doesn't matter what color your skin is, or what gender you are, or what sexuality you are. It doesn't matter which country you're in or what race you're in. And so to me, this sense that the concept of flow brings to us is a sense of progress that's radically different from that simplistic frontier mentality of just busting through everywhere and creating material advantage and competing with each other.
Expansion, right?
It is a different kind of expansion.
Yeah.
And it's always fascinated me that there are some people who have extraordinary powers of being able to achieve that state, and that the psychology tells us that the state itself is achievable by almost anyone. That to me it suggests that actually beyond capitalism, beyond this materialistic growth-based economics and society, there is a richer, more fulfilling place for us to be, and that it's achievable.
Edna?
Oh, I just have a kind of a simple comment. The flow thing is a really wonderful state. And, like I've experienced being in a choir, but, musicians, artists. But I just want to suggest a way that anybody can experience that I've noticed, like planting a garden with other people. Like I've done a little bit of that here. Planting a garden, particularly with other people, can give you that same sense, and that's accessible to anybody. And of course, also like going on a wonderful hike and looking at sandhill cranes or looking at anything. I think we tend to think of flow as something, that only special people can do, but those are some ways that I think anybody can experience it.
Thank you, Edna.
We need to be planning lots more. There's lots of places that are all messed up that need fixing. Yeah. Okay.
I agree with that. And actually the experiments, it was another of my students who've done a lot of experiments on where and when and why people experience the flow. And it is absolutely, it's not just elite sportsmen, or it's not just, kind of just exciting activities, meditating, physical activity, the walking that you talk about, the planting of gardens. These are all places where people experience flow.
Mm-hmm. What role do you think fear and belief in scarcity play in maintaining the status quo? I think of Bucky Fuller, his prediction about how, well, not prediction, but saying that we had crossed a threshold technologically, so that we had now, and this was, I think, 1976, wasn't it? That he said we had arrived at a point technologically where we could actually ensure that everyone on the planet could have a very decent standard of living, but that it would be another 50 years before we would realize it, because all of our institutions were based in scarcity. So how to address this? To me, fear and scarcity are identical. The idea that there isn't enough, and that if I have more, you have less, right? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And I suppose it was part of what I was trying to get at in the chapter where I was talking about power, because I think they belong together. If you believe the world is about scarcity and you're afraid of that scarcity, and you adopt a response, which is to struggle against that scarcity, against your fellow beings, in order to achieve a greater proportion of what's there, so that you can defend yourself against scarcity, that takes you in a very particular competitive direction. It creates a competitive culture. And I think we can say that ultimately that's really what capitalism capitalistic economics is built on. It's built on that struggle for existence, the fear of scarcity, the competitive instinct that comes from that, and what constitutes then, and it's even written into our philosophy, a war of all against all, a sense of continual competition with each other against that scarcity. And a couple of things that I explored in the book in relation to that. One is the sense in which that is the power of metaphor as much as it is the science of the world. It's a particular metaphor that science adopted, in particular through Darwinian theory of evolution, at a time when that theory itself was influenced by the fierce competition that was happening in the industrial towns of England, basically. And so there's a sense in which that social culture of the time colored the theory of evolution. And Darwin is very explicit about it. I run through some of the historical evidence in the book that he drew his metaphor of competition and struggle as the basis of evolution from Malthus, who was the person, interestingly, who gave economics the name dismal science, because his predictions were so dismal, and his opposition to the poor laws, for example, were legendary, because he essentially saw this competition as inevitable, an inevitable part of life. So there's no point even protecting other people from it, because it's going to happen anyway. And so it's a very dismal prognosis for humanity. And the two things in the book where I counter that, first of all, by pointing out that it's a metaphor, that it's socially contextualized, and showing how one woman, Lynn Margulis, really gave the lie to that idea, by showing that evolution itself was, as much as anything, the result of an extraordinary collaboration at certain points in the evolutionary cycle. In other words, saying collaboration is as important to our existence as competition is, and thereby placing a different metaphor. Yeah. And I think, I'm not saying that everything is collaboration, everything is cooperation. We know that's not true. We know that there's a sense of competition that's important, but it is again one of those points where balance comes into play. And we have to say, actually, these two metaphors should balance each other in our society, rather than one dominating the other, which is what has happened in capitalism over the last 150 years or so. And then the second insight that I explored in the book was this strange realization, as I was thinking about it, that Buddhism starts from exactly the same place that capitalism starts, with the idea that everything is suffering. Mm-hmm. But it takes a completely diametrically opposite tactic. It says that if you give in to that sense of struggle, and if you simply compete to have more, you will drive yourself and the rest of the world into more suffering. Mm-hmm. And the right thing to do actually is not to try and evade that suffering, not to turn away from it, but to turn towards it and bring compassion towards it. And that's such a radically different way of approaching the central truth of some of our lives in relation to the context of suffering. I found those two things. I found it extraordinary that they start from the same place, capitalism and Buddhism, and then they depart in radically different directions. And I used the work and the life and the example there of Thich Nhat Hanh as a way of talking about that. And I think, I'm not suggesting it's an easy tack, and I'm not suggesting everybody should be a Buddhist monk, but I think understanding the power that metaphor and the metaphor of struggle and scarcity has had on our economic system and on our society is really important. And that by understanding it, we have a chance to move away from it into a different view in which there are certain kinds of abundance, in which collaboration, for example, is something that can be as much a successful response to the idea of suffering as struggle and competition can be, and in many cases, much more so.
Yes, it's beautiful. Paul, we have just a couple of minutes left.
Sure. My comment can wait until the lecture is over, if that's possible. So I have kind of a technical question and suggestion. And I know your time is very valuable, but if you had a couple of minutes after the session closes, that would be wonderful.
That's up to
Sure.
you. Okay, well, anybody else real quick? We have 3 minutes left.
I would be really interested to hear a little bit, Gloria, about the project that you are engaged in terms of, particularly in terms of consciousness.
Yeah, well, you could say that it evolved from partly the healing modality that we practice, but also the idea that all suffering, you were just talking about suffering and any problem really is a problem of consciousness, right? And so whether it's war or issues in relationships or domestic violence or whatever, they are all problems of consciousness. And so if we raise our consciousness, if we understand, if we look into, as you were giving the analogy of the Buddhist facing the problem, that in itself raises consciousness, because when we face a problem, it becomes less scary. It immediately becomes, and I see this, one of the things I teach is dream work. And I see this in dream work where if some monster or some bad guy is chasing you and you have the wherewithal to just stop running and turn around and ask, what do you want from me? Invariably, that threatening figure becomes benign. It's no longer scary in the dream, right? And I think that's a good analogy for our lives also. And so I think, I think that Einstein was right when he said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And I think that the level of consciousness, not only that created it, but that perpetuates it, is what has to change. And so we promote, programs, classes, studies, events that address that. And I think that this is a very, and more since the pandemic started, I feel an urgency to apply the things that we have traditionally presented in the fields of, the convergence of science and spirituality and the exploration of spiritual themes and psychology and, many things that fall under consciousness. It's a huge field. I feel an urgency to, more than ever, to apply that to the existential problems that we're having and that we're facing in the world right now. And that's what led me to want to invite you, as someone who is talking about those things and not just theoretics, or theory about, considering these subjects theoretically, but actually thinking about, how can we solve the problems these.
Thank you. I think that's wonderful, a wonderful project, and I'm glad that I could spend this time with you, and I wish you all success with that.
Well, thank you.
I think it's really important work.
very grateful that you were able to spend this time with us, and thank you to all of you who attended. And we will see you again, I hope.
Thanks. Good night.
And get the book. Get this book. It is really, I mean, we really have just scratched the surface of all the things that are covered in this book. It is a wonderful book.
Thanks, Gloria.
Thank you.